She walked into the family reunion wearing a dress that cost more than the wife's car, holding the husband's arm like she had the deed to the property in her purse. Jessica Vance thought she had won. She bullied the wife, Lindsay, right in front of the guests, mocking her clothes, her silence, and her place in the family. She even told Lindsay to get used to the guest house. But Jessica forgot one crucial detail. The stern old man sitting at the head of the table, Arthur Sterling, wasn't just watching. He was keeping score. And when he finally stood up, he didn't just end the party. He ended her entire life plan with a single piece of paper. You won't believe who actually owned the mansion. The Sterling estate was not just a house. It was a fortress of old money located in the lush, rolling hills of Connecticut. To the outside world, it was a symbol of the American dream. Pristine white pillars, manicured gardens that stretched for acres, and a garage filled with vintage Jaguars and modern Ferraris. But to Lindsay Sterling, the mansion was a golden cage where the air was always thin and the temperature was always freezing. Lindsay had been married to Mark Sterling for 8 years. 8 years of trying to be the perfect wife, the perfect daughter-in-law, and the perfect hostess. She wasn't born into money. She was the daughter of a schoolteacher and a librarian. When Mark first met her, he claimed he loved her simplicity, her grounding presence. He said she was his escape from the superficial world of high finance. But as the years ground on, that simplicity became a source of resentment. Mark wanted a show pony, but he had married a workhorse. Today was the most important day on the Sterling calendar, Arthur Sterling's 75th birthday jubilee. Arthur, the patriarch, was a man of few words and terrifying intellect. He had built Sterling Industries from a single warehouse into a global logistics empire. He was retired now, theoretically, but everyone knew he still pulled the strings. Lindsay had been awake since 4 a.m. She was in the industrial-sized kitchen, directing a team of 12 caterers, checking the floral arrangements, and ensuring the vintage wines were breathing properly. Mrs. Sterling, the head caterer, a kind man named Henri, whispered, "You look exhausted. Please, sit down. We have this under control." Lindsay offered a tired smile, brushing a stray lock of brown hair behind her ear. "I can't, Henri. You know how Mark gets if the napkins aren't folded into the shape of the Sterling swan. It has to be perfect." Arthur notices everything." She looked down at her attire. She was wearing a simple, elegant navy blue dress. It wasn't new. In fact, she had worn it to the Christmas gala 2 years ago. Mark had cut her personal allowance specifically this month, claiming that business was tight and they needed to be liquid for some investments. Lindsay never argued about money. She made do. She polished her old pearls and wore comfortable heels because she knew she would be standing for 6 hours straight. By 6 p.m., the circular driveway was filled with luxury sedans. The elite of the East Coast were pouring in. Senators, hedge fund managers, and socialites. Lindsay stood by the grand mahogany doors, greeting everyone by name, taking coats and offering warm smiles to people who looked through her as if she were part of the wallpaper. "Where is Mark?" asked Mrs. Worthington, a heavy-set woman dripping in diamonds. "Usually he's right here at the front. He had a last-minute conference call, Mrs. Worthington." Lindsay lied effortlessly. "He'll be down shortly." The truth was, Mark wasn't on a call. He was gone. He had left the house at noon, saying he had to pick up a special gift for his father. He hadn't answered a single text since. Just as the grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 6:30, the heavy oak doors swung open. The room, buzzing with a low hum of expensive conversation, went silent. Mark Sterling walked in. He looked dashing in a bespoke Italian tuxedo, his hair perfectly coiffed, that charming, arrogant smile plastered on his face. But no one was looking at Mark. They were looking at the woman on his arm. She was stunning in a terrifying, predatory way. Tall, blonde, and wearing a scarlet-red dress that was cut dangerously low and slit scandalously high. It was a look-at-me dress, a homewrecker dress. It was Jessica Vance. Lindsay felt the blood drain from her face. She knew the name. Jessica was Mark's chief of public relations at the firm. Lindsay had seen the texts pop up on Mark's phone late at night. messages that were far too friendly for a colleague. She had smelled the cloying, expensive perfume on Mark's shirts. She had found the receipts for jewelry she never received. But to bring her here? To Arthur's 75th birthday? Into Lindsay's home? Mark spotted Lindsay standing by the stairs. He didn't look guilty. He looked defiant. He guided Jessica toward her, the red dress swishing loudly with every step. "Lindsay," Mark said, his voice booming a little too loudly, performing for the audience. "I'd like you to welcome Jessica. She's here to help manage the press for Dad's birthday. We're expecting some reporters later." It was a lie, so thin, it was transparent. Jessica wasn't holding a notepad or a camera. She was holding a clutch worth $5,000 and a glass of champagne she had snatched from a passing tray. Jessica looked Lindsay up and down, her blue eyes sharp as ice picks. She smirked, a cruel tilting of red lips. "So this is the famous Lindsay," Jessica purred. Her voice was smoky and condescending. "Mark talks about you occasionally. You're much plainer than I expected. Is that wool? In July. Brave." A few guests nearby gasped quietly. Lindsay gripped her hands together behind her back to stop them from shaking. "Welcome to our home, Jessica," Lindsay said, her voice steady despite the nausea rolling in her stomach. "Though I wasn't aware we had press coming inside the private residence." "Oh," Mark insisted, Jessica said, stepping closer, invading Lindsay's personal space. "He said he needed someone by his side who knows how to handle the spotlight. Someone who fits the image of the company's future." She reached out and flicked the pearls around Lindsay's neck. "Cute. My grandmother has a set just like that. She was buried in them." Mark let out a short, bark-like laugh. "Jessica has a sharp wit, Lindsay. Don't take it personally. Now, be a dear and get Jessica a drink that isn't whatever this house wine is. She prefers the 59 vintage from the cellar." Lindsay froze. The 1959 Chateau Margaux was Arthur's private collection. No one touched it. Not even Mark. "Mark, you know the cellar is locked. Those are for your father," Lindsay whispered. Mark's smile vanished. His eyes went cold. He leaned in, hissing into her ear so only she could hear. "I am taking over this company next week when the old man announces his retirement. Everything here is already mine. Now go get the bottle, or don't bother coming to dinner." Lindsay looked at her husband, really looked at him. She saw the greed, the lack of respect, and the absolute confidence that she was powerless to stop him. She turned on her heel, dignity hanging by a thread, and walked toward the kitchen. Behind her, she heard Jessica laugh. "She's obedient. I like that in a staff member." The main dining hall of the Sterling mansion was a masterpiece of Victorian architecture. A 40-foot table sat under a crystal chandelier that had once hung in a French palace. Tonight, it was set for 30 of the most influential people in the state. Arthur Sterling sat at the head of the table. He was in a wheelchair now, his body frail from a stroke 3 years prior, but his mind was still a steel trap. He watched the room with hooded eyes, saying very little. His hands, spotted with age, rested on the head of a cane topped with a silver wolf. To his right sat Mark, the heir apparent. And to Mark's right, in the seat that should have been Lindsay's, sat Jessica Vance. Lindsay had been relegated to the far end of the table, seated between a deaf uncle and a teenage cousin who was playing games on his own. She hadn't fought it. She was too busy managing the servers, ensuring the courses came out on time. The dinner was an agonizing display of Jessica's dominance. She was loud, regaling the table with stories of her and Mark's business trips to Paris and Milan, trips Lindsay had been told were grueling conferences. The suite at the Ritz in Paris was just divine, Jessica gushed, resting a hand intimately on Mark's shoulder. Mark insisted we get the one with the view of the tower. He's such a romantic when he's inspired. The table went quiet. Mrs. Worthington cleared her throat awkwardly. Everyone knew Lindsay had never been to Paris. Mark had always said it was too expensive to take a vacation. Arthur Sterling slowly turned his head toward Jessica. "I was under the impression that the Paris trip was for the merger with the DuPont Group," Arthur rumbled. His voice was raspy but carried across the room. "Strictly business." Mark jumped in quickly, sweating slightly. "It was, Dad. It was. Jessica was instrumental in closing the deal. We just had to celebrate the win." "By buying out the jewelry district?" Jessica laughed, flashing a diamond bracelet that glittered violently under the chandelier. "Mark is very generous with company bonuses." Lindsay looked down at her soup, her vision blurring. That bracelet likely cost more than her mother's entire pension. She felt a tear threaten to fall, but she swallowed it back. "Not here," she told herself. "I will not give them the satisfaction of seeing me cry." Suddenly, Jessica tapped her glass with a spoon. Clink, clink, clink. "Excuse me, everyone," Jessica announced, standing up. She looked like a scarlet flame in the dim room. "I know we haven't reached the toasts yet, but I just couldn't wait. I have a little announcement." Mark looked up at her, smiling like a cat who got the cream. "As many of you know," Jessica continued, her eyes locking directly onto Lindsay at the far end of the table, "Mark is poised to take over as chairman next week. It's a new era for Sterling Industries, and with a new era comes new changes." She walked around the table, her heels clicking on the marble floor, heading toward Lindsay. The room was deadly silent. The servers froze with trays in their hands. Jessica stopped behind Lindsay's chair. She leaned down, her voice dripping with fake sweetness, loud enough for the whole room to hear. "Lindsay, sweetie, Mark and I were talking. Since the company is modernizing, we think the house needs to modernize too. We're going to be doing some extensive renovations starting next month. The master suite, specifically." She paused for dramatic effect. "We think it would be best if you moved your things to the guest cottage by the lake. It's cozy. Much more your speed. You won't be in the way of the designers. Or us." The insult was physical. It was a slap in the face. She wasn't just kicking Lindsay out of the bedroom. She was evicting her from the marriage, publicly, in front of the family patriarch. Lindsay slowly stood up. Her legs felt weak, but her spine was stiff. "This is my home, Jessica. Mark and I have lived here for 8 years. You are a guest. I suggest you remember that." Jessica laughed, a harsh, jagged sound. "Oh, honey, look at you. You're wearing a rag from 3 seasons ago. You look like the maid, not the mistress of the manor. Mark needs a partner who looks the part. Someone who shines. You're just dull." Jessica reached out and picked up Lindsay's wine glass. "In fact, you look a little thirsty. Let me help you with that." With a flick of her wrist, Jessica tilted the glass. Red wine, the expensive vintage Lindsay had been forced to open, cascaded down the front of Lindsay's pale blue dress. It looked like a gunshot wound spreading across her chest. The room gasped. "Oops," Jessica smirked, not a shred of remorse in her eyes. "My hand slipped. But honestly, it's an improvement. At least now the dress has some color." Mark didn't move. He didn't defend his wife. He sat there, swirling his drink, watching Lindsay stand there, stained and humiliated. "Jessica, sit down," Mark said lazily. "Lindsay, go change. You're making a scene. And frankly, you're ruining the aesthetic of the dinner." Lindsay stood there, the cold wine soaking through to her skin. She looked at Mark, the man she had vowed to love. She looked at the guests who were averting their eyes, too cowardly to speak up. Then she looked at Arthur Sterling. The old man hadn't moved. His face was unreadable, but his knuckles, gripping the silver wolf head of his cane, were white. Lindsay took a deep breath. "I will not change," she said quietly, "and I will not leave." Jessica rolled her eyes. "God, you're pathetic. Do I have to call security to drag you out?" "Mark, tell her." Mark sighed, putting his napkin on the table. "Lindsay, don't make me do this. Dad's heart can't take the stress. Just leave. Go to the cottage. We'll discuss the divorce settlement in the morning." The word hung in the air. Divorce. It was out. The plan was laid bare. Mark intended to inherit the empire and discard the wife in the same week. "Is that so?" A raspy voice cut through the tension like a rusty saw blade. Arthur Sterling slowly pushed his wheelchair back from the table. The mechanical whir of the wheels was the only sound in the cavernous room. "You're discussing settlements, Mark?" Arthur asked, his voice low but vibrating with power. "At my birthday." "Table? Dad, I didn't want to bother you with this," Mark said, his voice shifting to a smooth, reassuring tone. "Lindsay and we've grown apart. Jessica and I are a power team. It's what's best for the family legacy. Lindsay will be taken care of. The cottage is nice." "The cottage?" Arthur repeated. He looked at Jessica. "And you like this house, Miss Vance?" "I adore it, Arthur." Jessica beamed, dropping the Mr. Sterling for a familiar first name. "But it needs life. It needs parties. Mark and I are going to bring this place back to its glory." "I see," Arthur said. He reached into his jacket pocket. "It is interesting you mention the house, because before we cut the cake, I have a gift to present. Usually the birthday boy receives gifts, but I find myself in a giving mood." He pulled out a thick, legal-sized envelope. "Mark, you've been waiting for this for years. The transfer of assets." Mark's eyes lit up. He practically vibrated with excitement. Jessica smirked at Lindsay. "Game over," her eyes said. Arthur placed the envelope on the table. "Lindsay," Arthur said. "Come here, child." Lindsay wiped a drop of wine from her chin and walked toward the head of the table, her head held high despite the stain. "Yes, Arthur?" "Stand next to me," the old man commanded. He looked at his son. "Mark, you seem to be under the impression that this house and the company are yours by birthright." "Well, yes," Mark chuckled nervously. "I'm your only son." "You are," Arthur nodded. "My only son, who has spent the last 5 years draining the accounts to fund business trips to Paris, who has neglected the logistics division to the point of near bankruptcy, and who has brought a woman into my house who insults my hospitality and assaults my daughter-in-law." Mark's face went pale. "Dad, wait." "Silence!" Arthur slammed his cane on the floor. The sound cracked like a gunshot. "I am not blind, Mark, and I am not deaf. I have known about Miss Vance for 2 years, and I have been watching Lindsay for 8. Arthur picked up the envelope. "You want to know who owns this mansion, Jessica?" Arthur asked, turning his gaze to the mistress. "You think you're renovating the master suite?" He slid the papers across the table. They stopped right in front of Lindsay. "Read the name on the deed, Lindsay," Arthur said softly. "Read it out loud." Lindsay's hands trembled, not from fear this time, but from the sheer weight of the moment. She looked down at the document Arthur had slid across the polished mahogany table. It was a deed of trust, stamped with the official seal of the state of Connecticut, dated 3 years ago, shortly after Arthur's stroke. The room was so quiet you could hear the ice melting in the crystal glasses. Mark was leaning forward, his face a mask of confusion and rising panic. Jessica was checking her reflection in a spoon, seemingly bored, confident that whatever piece of paper the senile old man had produced could easily be contested by Mark's lawyers. "Read it, Lindsay," Arthur urged again, his voice softer now, almost kind. "Read the paragraph highlighted in blue." Lindsay cleared her throat. Her voice was shaky at first, but as the words took shape, it grew stronger. "This indenture witnesses that the property known as the Sterling Estate, comprising the main residence, the guest cottages, the stables, and the surrounding 40 acres, is hereby transferred in its entirety to the sole ownership of the Sterling Family Trust." Mark let out a sigh of relief, slumping back in his chair. He chuckled, looking at the guests. "Oh, Dad, you had me scared for a second. A trust. That's standard tax avoidance. I control the trust, obviously, as the executor." "Keep reading," Arthur commanded, his eyes snapping to Mark like a whip. "The next line, Lindsay." Lindsay's eyes widened. She gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. She looked at Arthur, tears welling in her eyes. "Arthur, I don't understand. Read it, Jessica snapped, slamming her hand on the table. Stop being so dramatic and read the damn paper. Lindsay looked directly at Jessica, her expression hardening. She looked down at the paper and read clearly, her voice ringing off the vaulted ceiling. The sole trustee and beneficiary of the Sterling Family Trust, with full power of attorney and exclusive rights to the property, is Mrs. Lindsay Marie Sterling. The silence that followed was deafening. Mark stood up so fast his chair toppled backward, crashing onto the marble floor with a thunderous echo. What? That's impossible! That's illegal! It is perfectly legal, a calm voice spoke up from the middle of the table. Mr. Abernathy, the family's longtime attorney, whom Lindsay had seated next to the deaf uncle thinking he was just a polite guest, stood up. He adjusted his spectacles and pulled a matching file from his briefcase. I drew up the papers myself, Mark, Mr. Abernathy said. 3 years ago, when your father was recovering in the ICU, you were in Cabo San Lucas, I believe. You couldn't be reached. Lindsay was the one sleeping in the chair next to his hospital bed for 3 weeks straight. She made the medical decisions. She managed the estate staff. She paid the bills you ignored. She's a gold digger, Jessica shrieked, her composure cracking. The cool, sophisticated Mistress facade was melting, revealing the desperate grifter underneath. She manipulated a sick old man into signing away his legacy, Arthur laughed. It was a dry, rasping sound. Manipulated? Jessica, look at her. She's wearing a 3-year-old dress because my son cut her. Allowance. She's running this party like a catering manager because my son fired the event planner to save money for your bonuses. Lindsay hasn't asked me for a dime. In fact, she's the only one who hasn't. Arthur turned his wheelchair to face his son. I built this house, Mark. Brick by brick. It stands for stability, family, honor. You treated it like a frat house. You treated your wife like a servant. I knew that if I left this house to you, you would sell it within a year to fund your gambling, or your women. Or worse, he pointed a shaking finger at Jessica, would redecorate it with that tacky gold leaf she's so fond of. This is my inheritance, Mark roared, his face turning a violent shade of purple. He looked like a petulant child denied a toy. I am your son. You can't give my house to her. I didn't give it to her, Arthur said simply. She earned it. She is the Sterling legacy. You? You're just a liability. Lindsay looked down at the deed in her hands. The ink was dry. The seal was real. She wasn't a guest in her own home anymore. She wasn't the poor wife about to be sent to the cottage. She was the owner. She looked up at Jessica. You wanted to renovate the master suite, Jessica? Lindsay asked, her voice cool and steady. I'm afraid I'll have to deny that request. As the landlord. If Mark thought losing the house was the end of the nightmare, he was wrong. Arthur Sterling believed in total warfare. When he struck, he didn't just wound. He obliterated. Fine, Mark spat, adjusting his tuxedo jacket, trying to regain some shred of dignity in front of the horrified senators and investors. Keep the house. It's a money pit anyway. Old pipes, drafty windows. Enjoy the heating bills, Lindsay. I hope you can afford them on a school teacher's pension. Mark grabbed Jessica's hand, pulling her up. Come on, Jess. We're leaving. We don't need this. I'm taking over as CEO of Sterling Industries on Monday. My salary alone is $5 million a year. We'll buy a penthouse in Manhattan. Something modern. Better than this mausoleum. Jessica hesitated. She looked at Mark, then at the room full of powerful people. She was doing the math. A penthouse in Manhattan sounded good. Being the wife of a CEO sounded good. She squeezed Mark's hand. You're right, baby, let's go. This place smells like mothballs anyway. Not so fast, Arthur said. He waved his hand at Mr. Abernathy again. The lawyer nodded and signaled to the back of the room. A large projection screen, usually reserved for shareholder presentations, began to descend from the ceiling behind the birthday cake. Mark, you mentioned your salary, Arthur said, taking a sip of water. And you mentioned taking over on Monday. But there seems to be a discrepancy in your understanding of the company's bylaws. The projector flickered to life. It displayed a spreadsheet. Not just any spreadsheet. It was the forensic audit of the Sterling Industries executive expense accounts for the last 24 months. "What is this?" Mark whispered, the color draining from his face for the second time that night. "This," Arthur announced to the room, "is why there will be no CEO appointment on Monday, and why the board of directors held an emergency meeting this morning while you were getting your hair cut." The rows on the screen were highlighted in red. Asterisk item. Business trip. Paris. Cost. $145,000. Note. No client meetings recorded. Purchase of Cartier diamond bracelet. Asterisk item. Consulting fee. Vance PR firm. Cost. $25,000 per month. Note. Shell company registered to Jessica Vance. No services rendered. Asterisk item. Company vehicle maintenance. Cost. $60,000. Note. Restoration of 1965 Mustang registered to Mark Sterling personally. A murmur rippled through the guests. This wasn't just bad budgeting. This was embezzlement. This was corporate fraud. "You've been stealing from the company, Mark," Arthur said, his voice heavy with disappointment. "You've been funneling shareholder money into Jessica's pockets. That bracelet she's wearing, the company paid for it. That dress, the company paid for it. The lease on her apartment, company funds." Jessica froze. She looked down at the diamond bracelet on her wrist, as if it were a handcuff. She instinctively covered it with her other hand. "That's a lie," Mark screamed, but his voice cracked. "These are legitimate business expenses. Networking. Image building." "The board disagreed," Arthur said calmly. "They voted unanimously to terminate your employment, Mark, effective immediately, and they are filing a civil suit to recover the stolen funds. Roughly $3 million. Mark swayed on his feet. He looked at Jessica, pleading for support. "Jess, tell them about the work we did." Jessica pulled her hand away from his. She took a step back. The predator was realizing she had walked into a trap. Jessica stammered, looking around the room at the judgmental faces of the elite. "I was just doing what I was told. I sent invoices. I didn't know where the money came from. Mark told me he owned the company." "You cashed the checks, Ms. Vance," Mr. Abernathy interjected smoothly. "And since the consulting work was non-existent, that makes you an accessory to fraud. We've already forwarded the files to the district attorney." "Fraud?" Jessica screeched. She turned on Mark, her face twisting into a snarl. "You told me you were rich. You told me the old man was a vegetable and you ran everything. You told me this was all legal." "It is. I mean, it was supposed to be," Mark stammered, reaching for her. "Baby, we can fight this. We can—" "Don't touch me." Jessica shoved him away. "I'm not going to jail for your incompetence. You loser. You're broke. You're actually broke." She looked at Lindsay, who was still standing at the head of the table, clutching the deed. "Lindsay, listen," Jessica said, her voice shifting into a frantic, high-pitched plea. "I didn't know. He lied to me, too. He told me you guys were separated. He told me you were crazy. I'm a victim here." Lindsay stared at the woman who, 10 minutes ago, had poured wine on her and called her a maid. The audacity was breathtaking. "A victim," Lindsay repeated, her voice deadpan. "Yes," Jessica nodded vigorously. "He manipulated me, just like he tried to manipulate his dad. We women have to stick together, right?" The room went silent, waiting for Lindsay's response. Lindsay placed the deed gently on the table next to Arthur's untouched birthday cake. She walked slowly around the table, her heels clicking rhythmically on the floor. She stopped a few feet from Jessica. She looked at the red wine stain on her dress. Then she looked at Jessica's pristine, expensive scarlet gown. "Stick together?" Lindsay asked softly. "Jessica, you came into my home. You insulted my appearance. You mocked my marriage. You spilled wine on me to humiliate me in front of my family and friends. And you did it all while wearing jewelry stolen from my father-in-law's company." Lindsay took a step closer. She stood tall, her posture regal. She didn't need a designer dress to look powerful. She had the truth on her side. "You aren't a victim," Lindsay said, her voice dropping to a cold, hard whisper that carried more weight than a scream. You're just a bad investment that's about to be liquidated. Lindsay turned to the head of the catering staff. Henri? Yes, Madam Sterling? Henri stepped forward immediately, a look of grim satisfaction on his face. He had hated seeing Lindsay bullied all night. Please escort Ms. Vance off the property, Lindsay commanded. And Henri, check her purse before she leaves. I believe the antique silverware is easy to slip into a clutch. Jessica's mouth dropped open. How dare you! I am not a thief! You're wearing a stolen bracelet, Lindsay pointed out calmly. Why stop there? Henri signaled to two large security guards who had been waiting in the hallway. They stepped into the light, looking imposing in their dark suits. Miss Vance, Henri said, gesturing to the door, if you would please. Jessica looked at Mark, but Mark was sitting with his head in his hands, defeated. She looked at Arthur, who was simply watching the show. She looked at the guests, who were now openly staring with disdain. Fine, Jessica screamed. I'm leaving. This family is crazy anyway. I'm contacting my lawyer. You'll need a public defender. Arthur called out helpfully as the guards grabbed her arms. Get off me! Jessica shrieked as they dragged her toward the double doors. She kicked and screamed, a stark contrast to the elegant entrance she had made an hour ago. The last thing heard was her shouting profanities at Mark as the heavy oak doors slammed shut behind her. The silence returned to the dining room, but the air was lighter now. The poison was gone. Mark slowly lifted his head. He looked at Lindsay. His eyes were red, terrified. He looked like a man who had just woken up from a dream to find his house burning down. Lindsay, he croaked. Baby, look, things got out of hand. She cast a spell on me. You know how stress gets to me. I wasn't thinking. He stood up, taking a shaky step toward her. He put on his best, charming husband smile, though it wavered at the edges. But we can fix this. Dad is angry, sure, but we're family. And you own the house now. That's great. It stays in the family. We can make this work. I'll fire Jessica. I'll apologize to the board. We can start over. Just you and me. Like the beginning. He reached out to touch her arm. I love you, Lindsay. You know that, right? Lindsay looked at his hand. The hand that used to hold hers. The hand that had guided another woman into her home tonight. She felt nothing. The love she had nurtured for 8 years, through all the neglect and insults, had finally evaporated. She stepped back, out of his reach. Mark, she said. Yes, darling? He asked, hope flickering in his eyes. You mentioned the guest cottage earlier. Lindsay said thoughtfully. You said it was cozy. That it was. Much more my speed. Mark's smile froze. Lindsay, come on, that was just talk. I think you were right, Lindsay said. The cottage is available, but not for me. She pointed to the door. You have 1 hour to pack your personal effects. Only what you paid for with your own money, which, according to that audit, isn't much. Then I want you off my property. Lindsay, you can't be serious, Mark cried. Where will I go? I have no money. My cards are frozen. I hear the Ritz in Paris is nice this time of year, Lindsay said, a faint, ironical smile touching her lips. Or perhaps you can stay with Jessica, though I doubt her studio apartment has a view of the tower. Dad! Mark turned to Arthur. Talk to her. She's kicking your son out on the street. Arthur took a bite of his birthday cake. He chewed slowly, savoring the flavor. This cake is delicious, Lindsay, Arthur said, ignoring Mark completely. Is this the vanilla bean recipe? It is, Arthur, Lindsay replied warmly. Dad! Mark screamed. Arthur looked up, his eyes cold as granite. You wanted to be the man of the house, Mark. A man accepts the consequences of his actions. Lindsay is the head of this household now. I suggest you do as she says before she calls Henri back. And frankly, Henri has been wanting to throw you out since you were 16. Mark looked around the room. He was utterly alone. The guests were sipping their wine, the show over, the verdict delivered. He let out a strangled sob of frustration, kicked his chair and stormed out of the room, heading not toward the master bedroom, but toward the servants' exit. Lindsay stood at the head of the table. She took a deep breath. For the first time in 8 years, the air in the Sterling mansion didn't feel thin. It felt fresh. "Henri," Lindsay called out. "Yes, madame?" "Please bring a fresh bottle of the 1959 Margaux," she said, smoothing down her wine-stained dress. "And pour a glass for everyone. We have a birthday to celebrate." The days following the Red Birthday, as the tabloids later dubbed it, were a whirlwind of legal summons, changing locks and silence. The kind of silence that is heavy, not with tension, but with finality. Mark didn't leave quietly. After being ejected from the main house, he spent the first night sleeping in his vintage Mustang parked just outside the estate gates, because security refused to let him back in. By morning, reality and the cold Connecticut dew had set in. He drove to a motel on the outskirts of town, charging the room to a credit card that was declined 3 times before he found one that still had a $100 limit. Inside the mansion, the atmosphere had shifted tectonically. The morning after the party, Lindsay sat in the sunroom having breakfast with Arthur. For the first time in 8 years, she wasn't rushing to manage the staff or worrying if the toast was too brown for Mark's liking. She was simply eating. "Why did you wait so long, Arthur?" Lindsay asked, buttering a scone. She looked at the old man, who seemed lighter, as if shedding the weight of his son's betrayal had actually improved his health. "You knew about the affair for 2 years. You knew he was stealing. Why let it go on?" Arthur sipped his tea, looking out at the gardens where the gardeners were already hard at work, staff that Lindsay now paid directly. "Because, my dear, you weren't ready," Arthur said gently. "If I had exposed him 2 years ago, you would have tried to fix him. You would have blamed yourself. You would have thought, if I just try harder, if I'm just a better wife, he'll change. You have a savior complex, Lindsay. It's your greatest strength, but with a narcissist like Mark, it's a fatal weakness." Lindsay lowered her knife. He was right. 2 years ago, she would have begged for counseling. She would have taken the blame. "I had to wait until he crossed a line you couldn't ignore," Arthur continued. "I had to wait until he brought the wolf into the henhouse. I needed you to see him not as the man you married, but as the stranger he had become. Only then could you accept the power I wanted to give you." The legal battle that ensued over the next 6 months was brutal. Mark, desperate and cornered, hired a shady lawyer who specialized in men's rights and tried to contest the validity of the trust. They claimed Arthur was mentally incompetent when he signed the deed. They claimed Lindsay had exercised undue influence over a vulnerable senior citizen. But Mr. Abernathy was prepared. During the deposition, Abernathy played video footage from the hospital room 3 years prior. It showed Arthur, sitting up in bed, lucid and sharp, joking with the nurses while signing the papers. It showed Lindsay reading a book in the corner, completely unaware of what was being signed. Then, Abernathy played the ledger tapes, recordings from the security cameras in Mark's office at Sterling Industries. Mark had been so arrogant, he hadn't even disabled the internal surveillance. The jury watched in high definition as Mark and Jessica laughed about padding the accounts and mocking Arthur's senility. The divorce settlement was swift and merciless. Because the mansion was in a trust, it wasn't marital property. Because Mark's assets were actually debts and stolen funds, there was nothing to split. In fact, Mark left the marriage with a negative net worth. Jessica Vance fared no better. The district attorney, armed with the forensic audit, charged her with 3 counts of wire fraud and grand larceny. It turned out the PR firm she ran was nothing more than a bank account in the Caymans. She turned on Mark immediately, offering to testify against him in exchange for a plea deal. The love they shared evaporated the moment the handcuffs clicked. One rainy Tuesday in November, Lindsay stood on the porch of the mansion. A beat-up sedan pulled up to the gate. It was Mark. He wasn't wearing a tuxedo. He was wearing jeans and a jacket that looked 2 sizes too big. He looked aged, his face puffy, his hair thinning. He buzzed the intercom. "Lindsay? It's me." Mark's voice crackled through the speaker. I left a box of old records in the attic. My college stuff. Can I come get it?" Lindsay pressed the talk button. "Henry mailed that box to your mother's apartment in Florida 3 weeks ago, Mark." "Oh," Mark said. A long silence followed. "Lindsay, please. I'm living in a studio, above a garage. Nobody will hire me. The industry has blacklisted me. My dad won't take my calls. Just let me come in for coffee. Just 5 minutes. We were married for 8 years. Doesn't that mean anything?" Lindsay looked at the grand estate behind her. The place was warm now. She had repainted the hallway a soft cream, removing the austere gray Mark had insisted on. She had hosted a charity gala last week that raised $500,000 for literacy programs. The house was alive. "It means I learned a valuable lesson, Mark," Lindsay said into the intercom. "It means I learned that my worth isn't determined by how much I can endure. Goodbye." She released the button and walked back inside, leaving the gate locked. The seasons changed over Connecticut, and with them, the very soul of the Sterling estate transformed. For decades, the mansion had been a mausoleum of ego, dark mahogany hallways, heavy velvet drapes that blocked out the sun, and a silence so oppressive it felt like a physical weight. But 1 year after the infamous Red Birthday, the house was unrecognizable. The dark curtains had been pulled down, replaced by sheer, billowing linens that invited the golden afternoon light to dance across the floors. The stifling smell of floor wax and old money was gone, replaced by the scent of fresh lilacs and brewing coffee. Lindsay Sterling stood before the floor-to-ceiling mirror in the master suite, a room Jessica Vance had once plotted to destroy with gold leaf and tackiness. Lindsay smoothed the lapels of her white tailored suit. It was sharp, professional, and commanding. She wasn't the woman in the faded wool dress anymore. She was the woman who signed the checks. Today was the inaugural Sterling Phoenix Gala. It was Lindsay's brainchild, a symbol of the family's rebirth from the ashes of Mark's corruption. Downstairs, the ballroom was buzzing. But the guest list had changed. Gone were the sycophants, the leeching socialites like Mrs. Worthington, and the corrupt hedge fund managers who used to enable Mark's gambling. In their place were university chancellors, local artists, scholarship recipients, and genuine philanthropists. Arthur Sterling sat in his wheelchair by the grand fireplace, a tartan blanket over his knees. The stroke had taken more of his mobility in the last few months, and his voice was often just a whisper, but his eyes remained as sharp as shattered glass. He watched Lindsay navigate the room. She moved with a grace he had always seen in her, but which Mark had tried so hard to extinguish. "She runs the room better than I ever did," Arthur murmured to Mr. Abernathy, who stood loyally by his side. "She leads with empathy, Arthur," the lawyer replied, sipping a mineral water. "You led with fear. It's a different kind of power, more sustainable." Arthur chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. "Touché, old friend." Lindsay took the podium. There was no tapping of the glass, no desperate demand for attention like Jessica had done a year prior. She simply stood there, and the room naturally fell silent out of respect. "Thank you all for coming," Lindsay began, her voice clear and resonant. For a long time, the Sterling name was associated with accumulation. We hoarded wealth, we hoarded status, and we hoarded this beautiful home. But a home isn't a fortress. It's a foundation. Tonight, we launch the Sterling Scholarship Trust. We are taking the resources that were once wasted on vanity and using them to send 20 brilliant, underprivileged students to Ivy League universities. The applause was thunderous. It wasn't polite clapping. It was genuine admiration. In the back of the room, leaning against a pillar, was David. He was a landscape architect Lindsay had hired 6 months ago to redesign the gardens, to rip out the prickly, defensive hedges Mark loved and replace them with open, wandering paths. David was rugged, kind, and possessed a quiet confidence that didn't require a sports car to validate. He caught Lindsay's eye, and offered a subtle, grounding nod. He was the first man she had met since Mark, who asked her what she thought before telling her what to do. Later that night, after the last guest had departed and the catering staff, who all received double overtime pay now, were cleaning up, Lindsay sat with Arthur in the library. The fire crackled, casting long shadows. It was just the two of them, the survivors of the Sterling War. "Mark called again," Arthur said, breaking the comfortable silence. Lindsay didn't flinch. "Did he? He's lost the condo in Jersey. Apparently, the dealership fired him. He tried to skim a commission off the books. Old habits." Arthur sighed, looking into the flames. "He wanted to know if I would pay for a lawyer to sue you again. He thinks there's a loophole in the trust regarding the mental distress of being disinherited." "And?" Lindsay asked, swirling the 1959 Margot in her glass. "I told him the only distress he's suffering is the allergic reaction to hard work," Arthur said. I hung up. "I don't think I'll speak to him again, Lindsay. I'm tired." He looked at her, his expression softening into profound vulnerability. "I stayed alive for spite for a long time, Lindsay. I wanted to make sure he didn't ruin my legacy. But now, looking at you today, I know the house is safe. The name is clean. You are the daughter I never had, the only true Sterling in spirit, if not by blood." Lindsay reached out and held his frail hand. "Thank you, Arthur, for seeing me when I was invisible." "You were never invisible, my dear," he whispered, closing his eyes. "I was just blind." Arthur Sterling passed away 3 weeks later, quietly, in his sleep. The funeral was a massive affair, a testament to the respect Arthur commanded. The day was gray and rainy, a classic New England gloom. As the coffin was lowered into the family plot at the edge of the estate, a solitary figure appeared at the back of the gathered crowd. It was Mark. He looked like a ghost of his former self. His suit was ill-fitting and shiny with wear. His face was puffy, his eyes darting nervously. He didn't look like a grieving son. He looked like a man scanning a room for loose change. As the mourners began to disperse, Mark made his move. He intercepted Lindsay as she walked toward the waiting limousine, Mr. Abernathy holding an umbrella over her head. "Lindsay!" Mark called out, his voice cracking. He stepped into her path, blocking her. David, who was walking a few steps behind, tensed up, ready to intervene, but Lindsay held up a hand. "I can handle this," her gesture said. "Mark," Lindsay said. Her tone was devoid of anger. It was simply indifferent. I came to pay my respects," Mark stammered, rain dripping from his nose. "He was my dad, Lindsay, despite everything." "He was," Lindsay agreed. "He spoke of you at the end." Mark's eyes lit up with a pathetic, desperate hope. "He did? What did he say? Did he leave a letter? A codicil to the will? Maybe a small trust fund for me?" Lindsay stared at him. Even at his father's grave, all he could think about was the transaction. "He said he hoped you would find character, Mark. That was his bequest to you. The opportunity to build a life of your own, from scratch, without the safety net that you spent 40 years cutting holes in." Mark's face crumbled. The hope vanished, replaced by a flash of the old, petty rage. "This is easy for you to say. You stole my life. You're living in my house, spending my money, sleeping with the gardener." He gestured wildly at David. "You're the villain here, Lindsay. You turned him against me." "I didn't turn him against you, Mark," Lindsay said softly, stepping closer so he could see the absolute resolve in her eyes. "You did that every time you lied. Every time you stole. Every time you brought a mistress into his home. You evicted yourself from this family long before the papers were signed." She turned to Mr. Abernathy. "Let's go." "Wait, Lindsay," Mark shouted as she walked away, the rain soaking him to the bone. "I have nothing. Where am I supposed to go?" Lindsay stopped one last time. She didn't turn around. "You're a salesman, Mark. Sell yourself on the idea of starting over." She got into the car, and the door slammed, shut with a finality that echoed louder than the thunder. As the car drove away, Mark was left standing alone in the mud, A man who had everything and lost it for the sake of an illusion. The final loose end was Jessica Vance. News reached Lindsay a month later that Jessica's plea deal had fallen through because she tried to bribe a court official. She was sentenced to 3 years. She wrote Lindsay a letter from prison, a 20-page manuscript blaming society, Mark, and even Lindsay for tempting her with the lifestyle. Lindsay didn't even finish reading it. She fed it into the fireplace, watching the lies turn to ash and float up the chimney. 1 year later, on a crisp autumn evening, Lindsay stood on the grand balcony of the Sterling mansion. The sun was setting, painting the sky in hues of violet and gold. Below her, the garden was in full bloom, a masterpiece of resilience and color designed by David. She could see him down there, checking the irrigation lines, his dog running through the grass. She held a glass of tea in her hand. She felt the cool stone of the railing. She owned this, all of it, but, more importantly, she owned herself. The drama, the bullying, the fear, it all felt like a story from another lifetime. She had walked through the fire of humiliation and come out not hardened, but refined. She was no longer just a wife, or a victim, or a survivor. She was the matriarch. And as the first star appeared in the twilight sky, Lindsay Sterling smiled. The wolves were gone. The house was safe. And for the first time in her life, she was exactly where she belonged. What a satisfying end to a brutal family saga. Mark and Jessica thought that appearance, arrogance, and bullying were enough to steal a legacy, but they learned the hard way that character is the only currency that matters in the long run. Lindsay proved that you don't need to be born with a silver spoon to have a backbone of steel. Arthur Sterling's final chess move wasn't just about saving his house. It was about saving his family's honor by giving it to the only person who deserved it. What do you think? Did Mark deserve a second chance, or was Arthur right to cut him off completely? And what would you have done if you were in Lindsay's shoes that night at the dinner table? Let me know in the comments below. I read every single one. If you enjoyed this story of justice served cold, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow. And don't forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell so you never miss a new story. Thanks for watching and see you in the next video.